everyone. I'm going to start on time because I was a school teacher and I think things should start on time. Most of you know me. I'm Audrey Vernick. I'm the Director of Patient and Family Advocacy for the Brain Recovery Project. We have a very small group today, I believe, so if any of you want to move forward, we'd love that because we're hoping this is mostly going to be very conversational. About myself, I am the mother of an 18-year-old who had a hemispherectomy, and I have been working as the special education advocate for the Brain Recovery Project. I was trained, I think, in 2016, and I did that for a couple of years, kind of one-on-one, but we shifted our program to be more broadly focused so we could serve more people. And so now I do a lot of information, resource guides, and whatnot, so I'm your go-to person if you have IEP-related questions, and I'm going to learn today from Douglas more about homeschool options, and we can also talk about private school. So that's what we're going to discuss today. I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves, and we'll start with you, Douglas.
Good afternoon. My name is Douglas Petersma. I am a homeschool dad. I have 2 kids that I homeschool, and actually we've just gone down from 2 to 1 because my oldest daughter graduated this last week. But I've been doing that for about 7 years as far as my active involvement in the homeschool. My wife was homeschooling before that, so we've been a homeschool family for 13, 14 years. I'm also a researcher in the field of education. I work for the National Home Education Research Institute. And my major role in that institute is being the editor of a peer-reviewed research journal called the Homeschool Researcher. I do a couple of other things that are homeschool related. I direct a church-based homeschool cooperative, as well as a private business that provides co-curricular courses to homeschooling families. My role there is mostly in teaching Spanish. That's my training and background. And I finished my postgraduate work at Regent University a couple of years ago, completing a doctorate of education. But my connection with this group is really through my son. My son had I describe it as a partial hemispherectomy. I don't know if that's the right medical term, but he basically had one lobe on the right side of his brain removed and one disconnected for seizure control. That happened about 11 years ago. He has been seizure-free since then, which we are thankful, very grateful for that, and also for all the care that he got to get him to that point. But we've seen how he's been able to grow, and at least for our family, it has been a great opportunity to be hands-on with his education. All the way through, and he's now entering his high school level work. So that's the background that leads me here. I'm an advocate for homeschooling, and so I just hope to be able to answer any questions and hopefully give some input on that if anybody's got any questions.
Thank you. Angie?
My name is Angie Watman, and I'm a mother of 3. I have a daughter that had Rasmussen's encephalitis when she was 4, and she's now 19. And then I have twin boys that are 13. I also chair the Montana Empowerment Center, and we are the Parent and Training Information Center for the state of Montana. And so you'll learn a little bit more about what parent training and information centers do, because there's one in every state. But I was raised private school up until high school, and then went to public high school. And my husband, he went to public school his entire life. Our children, our boys, attended public school through 5th grade until COVID hit, and then we pulled them out and did a private hybrid academy school. And then our daughter has had a little bit of mixture of both. She did private school for preschool through 3rd grade. And then during 3rd grade, she had a teacher that didn't really understand her disability, and I just saw some conflicts. And so we transferred into the public school in 3rd grade because she needed a little bit more support than what the private school could give. And she did public school from 3rd grade through 7th grade, and then went back to private school because the school could not provide the services that our daughter needed at that time. So she's actually funded by the public school to attend private school.
Thank you. Nicole?
My name is Nicole Abreu Shepherd, and I am a mom of 3 kiddos, ages 7, 9, and 11. Before I was a mom, I was a public school primary teacher, so I have a Master's of Arts in Education, and I taught everything from 1st through 5th grade, mostly in a Spanish immersion public school in San Francisco, but I also taught in Seattle public schools and Chicago. My oldest, Alexis, hysterectomy at age 5.5. She has left hemimegalencephaly, and her journey's been crazy. So we have sort of done it all as well. I mean, she went to a small private Montessori preschool pre-surgery, which was great for her. She's in public school for the majority, kindergarten through currently. And unfortunately, she's been experiencing some serious medical setbacks this year. And so we've decided that next year we're taking all our kids and doing what we're calling a family adventure year. And so we're dipping our toes into that. And hopefully I'm hoping to just sort of talk about our public school journey, as well as, I mean, we've done a lot of non-traditional things within the public school, and sort of all the different kinds of options in public school, and just sort of how our decisions have gone along with whatever she happened to need at the time.
Great, wonderful. So when we were preparing for this presentation, we thought it was important to talk about all the different types of options in each category. So we're going to start with looking at homeschool and some of the various options that are available for homeschoolers. And Douglas, I'll let you take that, but feel free to add on anything.
Certainly. So homeschooling is one of those things that has changed even over the last couple of years. So what exactly is homeschooling? When I say homeschooling or home education, generally I'm referring to parent-directed education in the home, privately funded, so not funded via the public school system. That's generally what I would consider traditional homeschooling. And a lot of traditional homeschool families will start with perhaps what we would call a boxed curriculum. I'm going to get math, English, history, science, and all that from a particular publisher at a particular grade level based on where my child is at, and they're going to work through the material. I have found that most homeschooling families may start off that way, but at some point they end up in what we call an eclectic curriculum, where they're piecing together things because they find interests that their children have that maybe aren't fed by a particular curriculum, so they supplement it with something else or what have you. But at any rate, homeschooling in its traditional sense would be parent-directed education in the home that is privately funded. There are a lot of variations that we have on that now, and more so over the last couple of years. One of the biggest ones I would say, and you've probably heard about this, is unschooling. And if you've never heard of unschooling, the first thing that probably pops into your mind is they're not schooling, right? What are they doing? Well, it's not school. It's everything that school isn't. And my family is not an unschooling family. I read up a little bit on it. There's a lady named Carrie McDonald who has written a book about unschooling, and it's very good. I actually read her book. I learned a few things, applied it to our home education. But basically, it's child interest-driven learning. And that is where you take the interest of the child or student if they're a little bit older, and you tailor all of their education to those interests. And so they need some sort of a math, but their interest is in meteorology. So you tie everything you can in math to the interest of meteorology or whatever it happens to be. And so it's not, the idea there is the learning isn't forced. The learning isn't, okay, you have to do X, A through Z in this order on these grade levels and pass all the tests. So that's unschooling. Again, it's different. Not everybody is really comfortable with that. Most of us, having grown up in schools, would say, okay, I've got grade levels. I need to go through these grade levels. My children need to learn these things. And so most homeschoolers will, again, start with some sort of curriculum and work their way through. For my family, we have definitely been started with a core curriculum. There's a particular curriculum that I use with my daughter and then also with our son. And then, but we have added things into that, or we've taken a break from that particular curriculum for a year in science. I did that with my kids over the last couple of years. Did something different, but it was still learning at each one of their levels. Since COVID, really, there's been kind of an explosion in what homeschooling can be incorporated into. So I would say there is homeschooling that is also public school supported. For instance, if there's a homeschool family that wants to take a certain number of courses from their public schools, in most states, that is an option. You can take band, you can take Spanish, you can take sports things. Some of them will allow you to take up to half of the students' required courses at the public school. So that's what I would call public school supported homeschooling or public school augmented homeschooling. There have been a number of things a number of variations of homeschooling, such as families getting together. So again, COVID hit, school shut down, families started to get together to say, what can we do with our kids? Because either they didn't like what was happening with their schools transitioning to online format or whatever. And you get 2 or 3 families together, and maybe you have a teacher that you put in charge of that, and it becomes like a multi-family homeschool. We call that a homeschool pod. Some people call that a homeschool pod. There's various names for it. A lot of private schools came out with, hey, let's support the homeschool community. So you've got homeschoolers, but they're going to come to the school. The school's going to provide oversight, standardized testing, things of that nature. So there's private schools supporting homeschooling, if you will. And so that's an option. And then there's what we now are learning is being called hybrid schooling. And that is a school that takes primary responsibility for the curricular input into the family, but much of that work is done at home. I like to call that school at home, much like an online public school would be done at home. It's the same curriculum, it's the same information. It's simply being done from home, either via a virtual setting or something along those lines. So those are kind of the general types of homeschooling or variations that you can have in homeschooling. But I'm under no illusion that that's going to be the end of it, because I think we're going to continue to experiment and look at ways that best serve particular students. And when we look at our community of students, hemispherectomy students, there's, I think, a lot of unique things that we can draw from these various experiments. When you find something that is especially working for your child specifically, that's what I'm going to recommend, even if it's not the same thing that I do. It's find what is absolutely perfect for your child. There is no one perfect solution for everybody, but I believe there is a perfect solution for each individual. And it takes a little bit of work to find it, especially if you're considering any variation of home education. But I think it is definitely doable, because there are so many options out there nowadays, and there's so many resources out there that we didn't have. We did card catalogs, and our kids are doing Google, so it's a different world that we live in, and the availability of information and access to learning guides are, I think, very, very critical to that. So if you ladies have anything else to add to that, you certainly may.
Yeah, I mean, I've just started dipping my toes in. I am no expert in homeschooling, but in preparation for the family adventure year, and we have explored the gamut. Like, I started off with the hell with school. Sorry, the heck with school. We're just gonna unschool. We're just gonna go visit family. We'll just get in the minivan, and kids are just gonna learn. And my husband was just like, no, that's not gonna work for me. We need a schedule. So we've hip hopped all over, discovering different things. The kids went all to Montessori preschool, so we've been exploring what that would look like, setting up a Montessori-like environment at home and on the go, if we go visit family, so they can continue learning. We've thought a lot about Alexis, and she, as many of our children do, requires very systematic, explicit, intensive instruction when it comes to learning specific skills and like reading, writing, etc. I'm a trained reading specialist and a teacher, and I have a SPED license, so I feel pretty capable of doing that. But I can see even myself, when Alexis first came to school age, my mom said, "You're a teacher. You're not working full time. Why don't you just homeschool her?" And I think that's such a personal thing. Personally, for me, I had 2 young children who were very needy at home. My kids are all close together. And people make it work the way it works for them. But what I found during COVID, when they were home all the time, was that I had a hard time being her teacher and her mom, right? So that's something that we're thinking about a lot, and how we can so my husband's taking a year sabbatical, so we can sort of do this as a family, so it's not just me and the kids all the time like it was during COVID. But yeah, I'm going through some of this research on homeschooling. I mean, I've learned, even as a teacher, some new educational terms I've never heard, like Charlotte Mason, and different things like literature-based homeschooling and art-based homeschooling, and all of these different things. My research has mostly been into secular homeschooling, because we're not a religious-based family, so that's sort of where I've been looking at. But Doug is right, there's so many resources and kits you could order, or just free resources online. So I think it's pretty flexible nowadays.
Do you have anything to add on homeschooling?
I do think since COVID came around, homeschooling's become a lot more flexible. There's a lot of classes you can get on and take just random classes on OutSchool and different other, different other things that are out there that you can just grab a class here and there and have a different teacher and somebody else kind of walking your child through it, which makes it nice, because then you can take a break from teaching every subject and choose which subjects you want to focus on from there.
I'm going to add a couple things here as well, if you don't mind. So my older son had a hemispherectomy, but my younger son had a really rare medical condition. He was sick, he missed 2 years of school. And so during that time, I looked into all the options, and I was really surprised to learn how much there was that was supported by the school district that he could do at home. So people often ask about home hospital, and we'll talk about that when we get to the public school. That's almost a non-option, just I'll put it that way. But so in California, there's the California Virtual Academy, which every county has one. So you can check your state to see if there is a similar thing. That's a regular public school diploma, but you do it through a virtual academy. They don't offer maybe all the other things that a true homeschool program would, like groups and you still have to do all that. But at least the coursework is, there's a teacher looking at and grading the assignments and all of that. We looked at someone you mentioned, OutSchool, that's what it's called. There's so many resources out there now, and there was a ton that was free. And then there's one other that ended up costing money, but my mind is blanking, so I'm gonna move on because I didn't sleep well last night. So we're gonna switch over now to talk about just kind of the overview of private school types and options, and Andy's gonna take that to start.
So in private schools, the procedural safeguards don't apply. So something you really need to think about is that it's up to the private school if there's an IEP that's formulated, or if you have accommodations that are met. You don't get to do the complaint process like you do with public school, or due process or anything like that. You waive all of those pieces before you enroll, just to kind of give everybody that heads up. So you really have to look, if you're going to private school, individually what works for you as a family. There are a lot of different options. There's secular private schools, there's religious private schools, there's boarding schools, which is a whole another avenue for parents of children with special needs. And then there's private special education schools. Sometimes those private education schools can be pretty expensive. There are usually scholarships. Sometimes people can use their 529s for private schools to a certain dollar amount. Sometimes public schools do fund part of private school depending on certain criteria, so you have to check with your state to see. Some private schools may say that they work with children with disabilities, but you may find that there are areas where it's not exactly what you would think it would be. And then there's also the Montessori school, which is a lot of hands-on learning-based learning on an individual basis. And then there is the Waldorf schools, which integrates academics and arts more on a relational basis. And then there's the Reggie Imelo School, which is more of an early education, student-centered, self-guided, self-directed, relationship-building private school. That's all I have for the private schools. And there can even be other ones out there. I'm from Montana. There's a lot of outdoor little schools popping up. Forest schools, yes. Some of them are accredited, some of them are not. And so depending what your values are and where you want to go, you really need to pay attention. Because if you go to a school that's not accredited and you're looking at going to high school, public school, you just need to be thinking about what that's going to look like for your child. And there are resources that you can outreach through with the public school, being in a private school. So you can ask for the public school to evaluate your child. They'll do a full evaluation. They can give you services and check with your state, because every state can be slightly different. But they usually don't give as many services unless you're in a special ed school. They can bring them to this private school that you're a part of, or you may have to go to the public school that you're a part of. So really just doing your own research and finding your own comfort level is what's most important.
I believe it is federally mandated that, so the district is required to evaluate every child that's in their district region, whether that child, whatever school option they choose. So even if you're homeschooling, you can ask the district to evaluate the child in all areas of suspected disability every 3 years as required by law. And you can ask for think it's called Individualized Service Plan, ISP, or
Yeah.
something like Independent Service Plan, and that's what the relationship from the school to the private school, this is when you're not placed via your IEP, but like Angie was saying, sometimes it's very limited, and it can be, oftentimes the school teams don't realize that they can offer any services through a private school teacher, so sometimes you have to educate the team, and I've helped a couple of parents through that, so if you have questions, feel
Yeah,
free to
but
reach out.
it's also based on something called proportionate funding.
Mhm.
So it depends on, they set aside a certain proportion of funding to support what they just call non-public school students. So whether that's homeschool or private school students, et cetera. Usually, I mean, I guess it would be different. In our state or in my district, you have to go to your, whatever your neighborhood school would be for those services. But once that money runs out, then I don't think there's any legal obligation for them to
So
consider.
yeah, when you place your child in a private school on your own without the district being involved, it's called parentally placed at a private school. So the district is saying you chose to go there, so the obligations are very different. Whereas if you start in a public school and they fail to provide FAPE and you say you need to have paid for the private school that would be appropriate, they have to provide every single thing that child needs, right? So it's a very different approach. On the ISP for private school, friendly place, private school, I've seen a family get a instructor come to the home. I've seen instruction in the community. I've seen teacher go to the private school for instruction, and I've seen the student be required to go to the public school for that instruction. So it really varies district to district and kind of what their interpretation of the law is, but that is available. So yeah.
And I will say when Alexis, we were looking for a preschool for her when she was 3.5, and this was pre-surgery, and her seizures were well controlled, and she was developing great, and we just said, you know, let's look at our options. And the public school preschool was very limited, 2.5 hours, and we wanted something a little more, like we had done these parent-child Montessori classes, and she loved them, so. And it was the school that we found, well, we went to 1 million preschools, and I will say that all the private ones, even though she was not having active seizures, was developmentally not far off from where she needed to be, et cetera, they just saw epilepsy and that she had she was neurointervention, and just said, we can't support your child. And that was like pretty much universally. And then where we were taking Montessori parent-child classes was this teeny tiny private Montessori school, and it happened to be like directly behind our home, which is how we found it in the first place. They happened to be Catholic, but like, you know, we were fine with that because, you know, the kids weren't like going to mass every day or anything like that. And they said, you know, Montessori's for everybody, we'll take her and we'll be happily and we'll support her. And I did have to, when it became apparent that she needed an aid to be successful in a classroom environment, I did have to provide that aid. And luckily there's a therapeutic group that uses insurance to provide. And we were able to work it out, so we weren't paying for the whole thing. And there's a lot of times there can be therapeutic preschools and services that can use insurance to help pay for part of that. But with that, she was able to have a very successful preschool experience there. So sometimes, like if you're finding like a small, flexible, like you know, private school like that that's willing to work with you. But I don't know, it could have been a different principal, it could have been a different administration, it could have been, you know, and unfortunately that school is now closed after COVID and everything, so, and it only went through preschool. So it can be very different just based on what you find in your community. It could be great, it could be, you know.
In our community, they have a large Christian school, and we take in a lot of kids with different disabilities, and they actually have a title program that's paid for by the state for those children. But after about 3rd or 4th grade, that program goes away, and so the school really struggles to keep kids with disability taken care of in the school district.
You brought up an interesting thing about private school. Private school can reject your child. There's no protections unless they receive federal funding. So if you find out they receive federal funding for anything, like a lunch program or an after-school program, they are now required under ADA to have a reasonable accommodation but not to provide FAPE, because ADA is not IDEA, right? So just an interesting thing to be aware of. And when we talk about non-public schools, in a minute we're going to get to public schools. A non-public school is a private school that the district places your child in because they know they can't meet the child's needs. even a non-public school can say, no, I don't want that child. We don't think that child's a good fit for whatever reason. The district can't force any school to take your child unless it's a state-run school, like a school for the deafblind. And even in that case, if there's significant behavior issues or there's a situation where they just can't meet the child's needs, they can remove the child. So nothing is guaranteed, which is I think part of why homeschool in a lot of ways, like, a lot of us come back and thinking about how to never. So let's move on and quickly go over just the outline of what public school can be. And you see this is a really messy slide, and this is one of two, because the next slide is going to talk about all the different placements you could have within the public school, which is not the same as the school building, but the type of school program you are accessing.
And just varies upon how many people have a child in public school currently. Okay, so most. So I live in Chicago. So we have Chicago Public School District is the third largest school district in the country. And so there's like a plethora. All of these things are, depending on the size of your school district, may not be available. And we're a choice district, which means you can lottery, or like fill out an application, and they do a randomized lottery, and then you could go to any school in the district if you wanted to, but you're guaranteed a spot in your neighborhood school. So we chose a school that was a fine and performing arts public school, so that's what, it has a special program, so it's technically like a magnet program, but it's a regular public school, just because Alexis loves music and dance and arts and stuff like that. So that's what we chose. So it's a public school, and it's traditional, but it just is a magnet school because it has a special program. That's usually what magnet means. And so a lot of the schools can have different types of programs in it. You can have a charter school, which are, a lot of people don't realize, are also public schools. They're publicly funded. They are just sometimes privately run or run by nonprofit, and have a little bit more flexibility when it comes to teacher accreditation. They are held to all of the IDEA. However, sometimes the people who run those charter schools will tell you differently. So you have to be really careful about that. You have, I can't even read all these things, but basically there are different types of programs. There are public, we have 3 public Montessori schools in our district as well, and we have a lot of IB inter-baccalaureate, which takes a lot of like language and inquiry-based learning. So they have all these different types of programs that just kind of live within public school. But any public school is going to be subject to all of the standardized testing and any kind of regulation, whatever type of their programming is there. So there's a language magnet school. I mean, there'll be all sorts of different programs available depending on where you live. Language immersion, I taught in a public language immersion school where kids spent 90% of their day. I taught all the subjects in Spanish, and they sort of progressed until 50-50, 4th and 5th grade, English and Spanish, etc. So there are all those kinds of options. And I would say like therapeutic, residential, those are kind of on the spectrum of more on like the next slide of if you're a special education student.
Yes, and I'll just say one thing. So one surprise, I think, in the hysterectomy community, I was helping a family a few years back who was having trouble in middle school, was being severely bullied, developed severe anxiety, and just couldn't go to school. And the mom there hadn't been a really full evaluation of the child, and the family wasn't aware that the child had a visual impairment and an auditory impairment at the level that qualified the child as deafblind. And they ended up sending the child to the school for the deafblind, which was a residential school, and it was life-changing for this girl. She's plays Powerball, she's got a boyfriend, she comes home every weekend for 3 days, and she was in middle school, so a little older, so like obviously the 5-year-old would probably like, residential school, no way. But it actually really worked for her, and because they worked with deafblind children, they knew all of the strategies. The classrooms were quiet. There was no visual clutter. The teachers were trained in these specific methodologies. So this is central auditory processing disorder and hemianopia, which happen after every hemispherectomy. So if you're not aware that your child has it, consider an evaluation to look at that further, and that can get you eligibility. You can also get resources from those schools to come to your school and train your staff, or work with the child directly in the school. So the child doesn't have to be placed there, but they can get access to these. So just an important thing to know. And then let's just talk a little bit about some of the different placement options within the public school.
Yeah, so I'm sure a lot of people have heard the term least restrictive environment, and so they have 3 LRE 1, 2, and 3, and it's just sort of talking about the percentage of the day that your child spends with their typically developing peers or in general education settings. And what a lot of people don't realize is that general education setting doesn't actually just mean in the classroom. That includes lunch, recess, any sort of arts, music, classes, any time in the day that they're spending with their general education peers. Of course, our children are also general education students first, but if they have IEPs, then it require them. My daughter started out in kindergarten. 90% of her day was just in a general education kindergarten. She had a one-to-one aide. She had, services, speech, social work, PT, OT, and her teacher, the visually impaired and orientation and mobility specialist. But 90% of her day, she was just with her peers in a gen ed kindergarten. Although that year there were a lot of children with disabilities in that class, like 30% of the class had disabilities, which I thought was really nice because it was like the best of both worlds. Like there were 2 teachers in there, the SPED teacher was in there full time. It was like this beautiful blended model where the kids just, I think it can be hard to be the only anything. Like, when I went to college, in a lot of my classes, I was like the only Latina. I'm like, oh my God. Like, when you're the only, or if you're, if you're for work, like the only woman or whatever it is, it can be really hard to be the only of anything in a group. And so I think it was really helpful for her to, she's a very social child and she loved being around all her peers, but she also had like a cohort of people, of kids who understood why things were hard for her, and they got along, and we're still friends with a lot of them to this day, even though, people move and stuff. Apart from that, so if you stay up to 40% of your day, if only 40% of your day is pulled out for services or academics, you're still considered in that gen ed. And then some people call it resource room or pull out. Once you get from that 40 to 75%-ish, you're spending more and more of your time in a separate room that's only special ed kids getting services. And as Alexis got older, the school district really pushed to have her more and more pulled out from her gen ed peers. And I would say she started spending in 3rd grade more 50-50 in a pulled out setting. And special day class, I think is what they call it in California. So sometimes they call it self-contained, where you're in a classroom, usually of no more than 12 students with IEPs, and there's a special education teacher and some number of aides, and the majority of your day in a self-contained classroom with students with disabilities. And you may take have lunch and recess with general ed peers, or maybe some special classes like art, music, etc. PE, but the majority of your day you're being educated in a small group of children with disabilities. And then if you're like 100%, sometimes they have, so generally if you're in a program like a special day class in a school, public school, you will have some percentage of your day with gen ed peers, but you can also be in like a whole public special education school. Usually there's only a few of those, and it's more common like in high school. We have a lot of high schools that are SPED only. And they're great programs. We're looking at some of them for Alexis for high school. They just have tons of support and programming and community-based education and lots of other things. And then if you have a therapeutic's not on here, is it? But if you have a therapeutic setting, a non-public school, that's what Audrey was talking about before, where you've been in public school, perhaps you've tried the whole continuum of environments and placements. They can't meet your child's need, but you know of a school, or the district knows of a school. Most often I find it's parents who know of a school, or who are willing to push for it because the school district's not going to say, like, let's place you in this really pricey school. And then you can push to make the decision to get placed at a special school. I've had a really hard time. Like, I've been open to every kind of placement every year, and I've visited some of these schools, and I've had a hard time finding one that works for Alexis. They're like, really, we take kids with average or above IQs, who are super bright, but maybe just have a reading disability. I'm like, well, that's not quite her. And they won't, I have a lot of friends in the autism community, and it's very difficult. You have to find a school that's like only certified for that, because a lot of the other schools won't take children with any behavioral issues, with autism. It's very strange. You know, and we visited schools that seem like they would be good for her, but you know, they don't really have a reading or writing curriculum, and she really loves reading again. You know, so the expectations maybe aren't quite what we were hoping for her. So, and I've never actually visited a residential school, so I don't know.
Usually they're therapeutic, like if there's severe behavior disorder, it'll be a short-term therapeutic residential placement. But a residential school can also be a school for the blind, a school for the deaf,
Yeah.
school for the deafblind. They're not always residential, it just varies state by state. One thing about disability-specific placements in schools that I want to mention is if the district tells you, well, your child has autism, therefore they have to be in this classroom, or your child needs a nurse, therefore they need to be at this school. Ask questions if that doesn't feel right to you, because that may not be true. The nursing is one thing because there are staffing limitations, but like a student with autism might really benefit from a more inclusive setting. And once you take them out of that environment, that is the most restrictive, is to remove them from the general ed setting completely. For my own son, in 4th grade, he was clinically depressed. He was in public school. He had almost all of his classroom time in the hallway because he couldn't handle the noise in the classroom. And the district offered him a private school placement at a non-public school. So it's a private school that's certified by the state to be a direct placement. And it was a school for kids with all different kinds of disabilities, but none of them severe. And so it wasn't a perfect fit, because I don't think the perfect fit school exists for children with hemispherectomy. In my experience, if you find it, let me know, because I want to go visit it, and go like 1,000 more, right? But it worked really well, and it was a lot better for my son than the placement he was in. And the district saw the need, and they were like, he's failing school. So academically, he was doing okay, but he was depressed. He would say to his therapist, I'm going to walk in front of the bus. Like, it was really bad. So that's how that can sometimes happen. But I would just be really careful about when the school is telling you your child has X disability, therefore they have X option only. That's kind of what we're hoping you learn today, is that you can integrate a lot of these various things. You could be homeschooling, doing private online classes for credit, and attending public school. You could do all three at once. So what I'd like to do now is it's 2:40, so we don't have a ton of time left, so I'd like to just open it up for questions. I'm going to hop down and get the floor mic, all the questions that you need in the mic, and then hopefully we'll have some good questions and go from there. Anyone want to kick us off? All right. Is that on? Go ahead, try again.
Yes, hello. But my question has to do with something you mentioned earlier.
Can you hear? Is that
No,
again?
no, it's not on.
Just not.
Oh, it might be the guy back there.
And he's not here. Does he have another one?
This one?
It's okay, I'll restate the question into the mic.
Okay, great.
Yeah, while this-
So my question just has to do with something you mentioned earlier about ISP
Yeah.
versus the IEP. What is the ISP and what is, like, I guess I'm kind of confused as to what
So
that does.
when you're not in public school, if you are a child with disability, you're still they're still required to service you for a certain amount of, like what I was talking about, the proportionate funding. They reserve a certain amount of their money, of their special education funding, to service kids who are not attending public school.
And is this the school district or
The school district,
private
or what is that?
So it's
Yeah.
a individualized service plan, and so after this public school would do an evaluation on your child, if they were in private school, they would then be able to say, okay, we can offer you these services if you're at that private school, and they can either offer them at the private school or at the public school. They're supposed to offer them at the private school, but some schools state you have to travel still. And so it could be a list of like physical therapy, speech therapy, counseling services. Yeah.
It might help lay out accommodations as well. It's like an IEP light, is what I would call it.
Oh.
And it doesn't provide FAPE, other than the triennial evaluation that's required. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty limited in my experience, but I think it's very dependent on where you live. In Chicago, it's not great.
We have a service plan with our daughter, and she can have physical therapy, occupational therapy, and counseling services.
And they come to her school.
They come to her school.
Yeah.
Okay. And you're evaluated at the public school?
So the question was, can you be evaluated at the public school? So yes, if you're homeschooled, privately placed in any private setting, the district is still obligated because it's their student, regardless of where they go to school. They're required to evaluate the child every 3 years in all areas of suspected disability. That is a district obligation. And that includes if the child needs a neuropsychological evaluation or a central auditory processing evaluation. If there's an area of need that needs to be assessed, even if the district doesn't have that evaluator, they still need to find one. They'll have to hire one if they don't have that person. And that obligation exists wherever you place your child. So I would take advantage of that, especially like the neuropsych in high school as they're aging out, because once they're adults, you pay for your own. And the school district won't pay for that anymore. And that's every 3 years they're required to do
And I
this.
will, let's say like in Chicago, I mean, they have a central office that does non-public, it's just like, they just call them non-public evaluations. So I think it's very different depending on what district you live in. It might not be your child's local neighborhood school. It might be, you know, at the main district office with a team that does central office, like non-public evaluations. But I was thinking about, now I don't want to use the acronym, the LEA, the Local Education Agency, which is usually a school district, but in more rural areas can be like, cover a couple counties, so it depends on where you live. But yeah, they have to have a team that will evaluate your child. So that it's usually available like on the district website.
But even, so the district can use their own evaluators always, but you are always entitled to an IEE, which is an independent educational evaluation at district expense. So the district is obligated to do an evaluation that is comprehensive and valid. So if they're missing something, like you say, I'm concerned about my child's attention, and they do no measures of attention, or they spell the name wrong, or use a different birth date, or they use she instead of he, which makes it clearly a cut and paste assessment. You can say, you know what, this assessment either isn't accurate, it doesn't accurately reflect my child's needs, or it's just wrong. Or you can just say, I want an IEE, and their options are either to say, yes, we will pay for an IEE, which means they pay for an evaluator you choose, or they have to file due process against you to prove that their evaluation was comprehensive and valid. And 99% of the time, the district will just fund the IEE because it's not worth the fight. Now the challenge—
Unless you live in Chicago, because they default always do
Yes.
due process in Chicago. I mean, that's true. They
And that's
default
kind of
will
new.
always go to due process.
That's kind of new. In San Francisco, they're starting to do that now too. They're starting to reviews. But generally, the pattern has been it's fund or file, and they usually fund. One time, I helped a family, and they requested 13 IEE assessments at once, and the district said, we're going to file due process against you. And the parent was freaking out, so they went to meet with the director of special ed, and they said, what we really need is a neuropsychological evaluation and a central auditory processing disorder evaluation. And they said, okay. And then those two evaluators recommended basically every other evaluation that the child needed, and the district ended up agreeing to all of them eventually. But it's scary, I think, for them if you come out the gate with everything at once, so I would just be selective about what you're asking for. We have information about IEEs on our website. There's a great attorney named Jen Laviano, who's a good friend of ours. She runs it's called Your Special Education Rights, and she has like little videos where you can walk through the process, and they do this cute one where it's like, I would like an IEE. Why? I don't have to tell you that. You don't. Like that's basically it. It's better, I think, if you explain why, but that is true for homeschool, private school, or public school. When the district is obligated to evaluate, you always have that right to an IEE. If the evaluation wasn't a true reflection of your child, or the evaluator didn't understand the condition. You can't have an audiologist who doesn't even know what central auditory processing disorder is do an evaluation on a child with half a brain. I mean, it's basic common sense, right? So, any other questions? Yes. Well, let me have her go.
Yeah, sure.
When do you do that ask? Because we just got the letter before we came here that he's up for an eval.
So when do you ask for the IEE, or when do you ask for a reevaluation?
Well, we just got the letter that he's up for it. So when do we
He's
ask for that?
due for an evaluation. So the district gets the first bite at the apple every 3 years. So they are allowed to do their full, whatever they think is a full evaluation. And then when they're done, you can say, yeah, no, not good. And then you have a 2-year, I believe it's 2 years, this varies by state statute of limitations. So you could, on, a year and 9 months later, say, you know what, this was not a good evaluation. That's why this IEP is crap. We want you to do an IEE. And I would be specific, like asking for an IEE in absolutely everything. I just think you're making fire with the district, so Yeah.
We had the same experience with the school district. It's us to due process as well, we requested. But, yeah, anyway. But every 3 years, so requesting full comprehensive evaluation every 3 years
Yeah.
is what's recommended.
Yeah, and I have, if you haven't been to our website, and we have like 5 different webinars on just on assessments. They're free, and they're, just go look at them, and I really, Monica and I did them, we split them up, and they're so detailed about this process, so, yeah.
And I will say, like, even though this year my kids aren't going to be enrolled in school, Alexis is due for her triennial, and I will take her to like the central, like, you know, so that way we can do a full evaluation and sort of, hoping she's a little more stable medically then, and that, you know, we can sort of start fresh with some new information there.
But does this mean you can only have an evaluation every 3 years?
Well, now we're sort of getting into a different kind of.
I know, let's just answer that one question, we'll move on to evaluations, no.
No.
So you can have an evaluation as often as needed. They'll say, well, definitely not more than a year, that's only if there's test bias, like they don't want to give the same test. But if your child has a craniotomy and they were evaluated 3 months ago, and you're like, we need another one before we can put them back in school.
Or they
see
have
what's needed.
hydrocephalus.
They have anything, yeah, ask for, don't think there's no minimum evaluation time, other than repeating the exact same test already due to test bias. Any other questions? Yeah.
I want to make sure I understand this. The ISP is a federal requirement?
Yes,
Or it's
Individual-
not just individual states?
it is a
It may be called something different in here. It might not be, you know, like, I think schools call, I mean, every district, like, we don't even call them students with disabilities in Chicago. They're called diverse learners or whatever. I mean, yeah, so it might be called
I've
something
never
slightly
heard
different.
them funding
What state are you
for
in?
New Jersey.
Because in Pennsylvania, they don't even call it an IEP. What do they call it?
Oh, I know, they call it something wonky, I don't know.
Texas has a different name for it.
Yeah.
I've just never heard them funding, like if I was homeschooling my child, I've never heard of them funding
If your
a
child- yeah.
speech therapist to come into the home.
So
for
I will say,
homeschooling.
yeah, for example, I don't know what the federal, if they're allowed, because Chicago does all sorts of things they're not supposed to do, but in Chicago, you have to go to your local public school to access, like, you have to physically,
Yeah,
I would have to
yeah.
walk Alexis down there for
Yeah.
30 minutes of speech, which we live on the same block as our local public school, so that wouldn't be a huge deal. So that's how Chicago does it. So
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like Montana has a much better
As I
setup.
say, in New Jersey, that I've heard of.
Yeah.
Where they can come to the school to do it, but I've never heard of them coming.
Well, the example I gave of the 4 different options, those are 4 different people in 4 different school districts. It depends on the size of the district, your relationship with the district. In one case, the teacher was also the child's private tutor and was like, I'll just come to your house and do it. You know, so it really varies depending on what it is and what the relationship is. Yeah.
When Alfredo was young, the school district did pay for therapists, and they came to the house, but it was
Oh, yeah.
because he was
I mean,
medically.
yeah, no, the same thing when young, but once they age into, you know, the district, or into, so like,
Yeah,
I
he
forget
was
what it's
aged.
called. No, but like, up until 5 years old, or even, you can have them come into the house. So like, altering preschool and everything.
Yeah, he was like 6. I think it was based on medical necessity.
Yeah, I mean, if, medical necessity,
yeah.
yes. I'm
Yeah.
talking more specifically for homeschool.
In
not
some-
medical
in
necessity.
some
Not
states-
medical necessity.
I mean, homeschooling laws, from what I've been researching very, very widely. So like for example, in Illinois, I don't have to do anything. I don't even have to inform the school that we're homeschooling. Like here's an optional form to tell your school district that you're deciding to homeschool. I don't have to tell them what I'm doing. I don't have to produce any portfolios. I don't have to do any tests. I get no home visits. Like literally, it's the Wild West in the Midwest there. And then there's another, I forget where it was. It was like pretty extensive. Maybe it was Maryland that I was looking at, where like you have to like show all your whole, like you have to submit your plan. Like you have to show your things. You have to, you know, talk to somebody from the district every quarter. You have to take the standardized test. Like, so it's like from nothing to basically like you're running a public school out of your house. I think in California you can register your homeschool as like a private school, and that's how
But
they.
that's education, not services. So you were going to
Yeah.
talk a little bit about the different, do you know about the different state options in terms of being a homeschool parent?
So again, it's going to vary state to state, so you really got to dig into your state regulations. But what I have seen, and I'm going to make a generalization here, so again, everything's going to have to be double check it all. But from what I have seen in most states, even homeschoolers can take advantage of public school offered services. So if your child qualifies for OT, PT, speech, whatever, and the school district is responsible for providing that, the school district will then need to evaluate to validate that that is a need within your home. And then of course it's going to depend on the district. I don't know, in Wyoming we're very rural. So as far as like getting a therapist to come to your house, that may or may not happen if you're in, somewhere outside of Cody, Wyoming. Well, in the bigger cities, you're probably going to be able to have that happen. And so even when our son was enrolled in Connections Academy, he was able to have his therapies. And he does some online, he does some in person, and it really depends on what you need. But I would say this, as a parent, you have to be very proactive at this. This is not something the school district is going to come and say, okay, it's time for your evaluation, let's see if I can
They're
give you
not gonna do
services.
that.
Well,
So-
I do know one thing they do allow, I don't know about that, but they do allow if you're homeschool or if you're in a private school doesn't have extracurricular activities, you can participate then in the school district.
A lot of schools
And they
like
make
that.
accommodations for
Yes.
their.
I'm gonna put that, say that on mic just for the recording, because a lot of people hopefully will watch this later, but if there are no extracurricular activities available to the child, they are allowed to access the public school extracurricular activities. That's good to know as well.
And another thing, since COVID, the federal government is really pushing schools to start thinking outside the box.
Yeah.
So looking at just, group projects or individualized learning in different unique ways. So I think we will see public education change throughout the years, but how that changes,
You had a question over here.
I was just gonna comment, like our state, Wyoming, they, I can't remember what high school age, but you can actually push your kid in the, like, we have a community college in our town. You're allowed to put your kid to start to get, what classes he wants to take, like you can start your math, English, science. So the basic one.
Like a dual enrollment?
Yes.
Yeah, put that on there too.
So they,
Yeah, that's really good. And that's, once you get to high school, it's kind of weird because K through 8, you're just going to school. It has to be accredited, but once you get to high school, you're actually earning credits to graduate. So that's where things can be a little different.
I've actually known students that graduated high school with an associate's degree, with a college associate's
Yeah,
degree.
yeah.
They've done enough dual enrollment that they finished high school the same year they graduated with an
Yeah.
associate's from a local community college.
Yeah.
So it's a flexibility option.
I will just echo what Doug was saying too, though. Like, I think whether you're doing homeschooling or private school or public school, we've tried all these different options, and I keep thinking maybe this will be less work, but it's never less work. I think, and it can vary a lot. I think it's been less stressful when Alexis is doing well, not having seizures, et cetera, et cetera. It is less stressful as a family. But even then, when her health was great, she was recovering beautifully from her hemispherectomy, she was like rocking school, making friends. I think we had 10 IEP meetings that year in her kindergarten year, 10. And that was like, she had this perfect environment with this blended kindergarten with these teachers who were really dedicated and very well trained. Ms. Courtney, personal aid, she actually came with to a conference here. She just loves like our community so much. And even then, we had 10 IEP meetings, and her annual took 3 3-hour meetings to get through, because I had people say the same thing. How do we know she's even going to be able to learn how to read? And I think this is sort of attracting to like, well, let's see what we can do on a year. And I just want to say one thing. I had a friend very early on who had an adult son with cerebral palsy, very high support needs. And she said to me, it seems intimidating, but in a way it can also, if you look at it this way, it can be freeing, because when you have a typically developing child, you just kind of sometimes fall into the trap of feeling like, well, this is how you have to do things because this is how things are done, right? But nobody's going to say anything to you if you're like, well, we're just going to go half-time because my child wants to focus on, wants to learn how to swim and do different therapies and wants to be a whatever. Like when you have a child with disabilities, it gives you this sort of sense where you can do anything. And since Alexis is my oldest, now I'm like, I could also do anything for my other 2 kids because I'm their parent. But you don't really think about it that way at first. And so, she's gone to school part-time, to do more intensive therapies. And we considered home hospital or homebound instruction this year. But I didn't feel in the end it would be worth it, because homebound instruction, like she had hydrocephalus and shunt surgery, and she just lots of things.
Also, homebound is usually 1 hour a day.
So it's 1 hour a day where they send somebody to come to your house for 1 hour of instruction a day, and it has to be after school hours. So somewhere after between 3
Depending on
and
your
6.
district, because I know districts. that-
Yeah, so in CPS it has to be because they're teaching during the day, so they send the teachers. So after they've done a full day's work, they don't have separate homebound teachers. And I just said, you know what, we'll just send her to school. They also have intermittent where you can go when you're feeling well and then and alert them in the same day, and because our district is pretty big, so they have that flexibility. And I just said, I'll just send her when she's up for it. But it was a very uneven experience because she was missing instruction half the time, and the flip side is that my daughter is she loves going to school and being around her friends that she's known since kindergarten, so I'm a little nervous about that this year. But we always said that every year is a new decision point for us, for Alexis, depending on how she's doing, her medical, her development, what she wants, and our family situation as well, right? Because it's everybody's needs, not just one child's. And so we've sort of made slightly different decisions every year. But I think that's sort of the big takeaway that I wish I had kind of caught on to a little bit earlier, that I could be more creative and push for things that make sense for our family, instead of trying to fit into the box as much as I did in the beginning of her educational career.
So we are out of time, but if there's is there one more question? Do we have anyone else who has a question? I just want to end, when we were talking about this panel, I think the message, if we were going to leave you with one thing, is that there isn't a right way to do this, because these epilepsy surgeries result in very complex children. And whatever you do whatever you choose to do at that time is the right thing to do until it's not, and then you're going to make a different choice. And if there's don't beat yourself up about it. Don't be like, I wish I had done this. You can always make a change. And our kids are actually really adaptable. I've been very impressed with the changes I've made for both my kids over the years, but especially my son with a disability and how adaptable he's been. Everything is a lot of work. So homeschool is not more work than public school, which is not more work than private school. When you have a child as complex as ours, it's all a lot of work. So I hope you'll look to our resources at the Brain Recovery Project, come to Power Hour. I have something called the Almost Everything List, which I'm really literally trying to list everything on. If you haven't seen it yet, it's under Info and Resources. I will list, I did attach in SCED a resource guide from today, from this session, and I'll also put all those resources on the Almost Everything List. We were going to call it the Everything List, but we thought that was a little arrogant. So. and it is actually a work in progress, and 15 to 30 minutes a week, I'm in there adding things that I've bookmarked to save, to share with all of you, and it's every single topic you could imagine. There is a survey that we'd like you to fill out, and I just want to thank all of you for doing this. I want to thank Douglas for bringing this topic to us. I think this was a really great topic. I think there's a lot of interest in it, and I'm available to stay for a couple minutes after, and I think probably our speakers are. And thank you so much for everything.